Imagine a world where the most powerful people treat the justice system not as this absolute authority, but just as a minor inconvenience.
Right, like a stop sign in a deserted parking lot that you just roll right through.
Exactly, without even tapping the brakes. And I want to welcome you to a brand new deep dive today, because usually when we talk about poetry, there's this expectation of abstraction.
Yeah, lots of metaphors about nature or, vague philosophical musings.
Right, exactly. But today we are stepping into a literary landscape that just completely strips away all of that abstraction. We're looking at a raw, bleeding indictment of reality.
It really is.
The text we're diving into is called Are You Afraid of Criminals? By Warathunga W. Nimmo. And my goal today is to kind of put on my literary analyst hat and really dissect the vivid imagery and the direct, unfiltered accusations the poet uses here.
And while you unpack the anatomy of those words on the page, I really want us to look at the anatomy of the anger behind them.
Oh, absolutely.
Because we need to explore the broader social context,
Yeah.
the immense public frustration embedded in this text.
Yeah, there is a lot of frustration.
Huge amount. But before we get into the weeds, I do want to establish a quick ground rule for this deep dive. Because this poem points fingers directly at ruling factions and state institutions, our goal today isn't to put these claims on trial.
Right.
We aren't taking a political stance or endorsing the demands made in the text. We're here strictly as impartial guides, just to analyze the underlying mechanisms of societal exhaustion that the author has captured.
Well said. We're basically looking at the mirror the poet is holding up to society and, examining the cracks in the glass.
Precisely.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's start with the first of those cracks, which the poem establishes right in the opening lines.
The flight of the powerful.
Yes. The poet paints this incredibly stark picture of the powerful completely subverting the law through literal physical flight. We read about one individual who, quote, destroyed the country and fled, while another heads to Singapore. And what strikes me immediately is the phrase about these figures blinding the eyes of the law under the guise of seeking medical treatment.
Yeah, that part is so vivid.
It really is. I mean, they aren't portrayed as fugitives sneaking out in the dead of night. They are accused bigwigs who are departing with paperwork.
Yeah, it reads less like an escape and more like a sanctioned bureaucratic departure.
Exactly. The poet is essentially saying the law isn't blind, it is actively choosing to look away when a certain class presents a doctor's note and a boarding pass. I mean, it's written like a dark VIP fast pass at an amusement park.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
But instead of skipping the line for a roller coaster, they're skipping accountability entirely. So how does this literary depiction of bigwigs fleeing for refuge reflect what the public actually feels is happening on the ground?
Well, what's fascinating here is that distinction between a fugitive and a sanctioned departure. Sociologically, what the poet is capturing is a profoundly modern sense of disenfranchisement.
Okay, tell me more about that.
So the public perception driving these lines is the belief that wealth and political power grant literal physical immunity.
Right.
To the average citizen, the law is this unyielding concrete wall. If an ordinary person commits a crime, they face the immediate physical force of the state.
No questions asked.
Exactly. But for the elite, the poem suggests the law is entirely porous. The specific mention of traveling to places like Singapore for medical treatment that highlights a recognized systemic loophole.
Which is so frustrating to read.
Oh, totally. It points to a reality where medical tourism is perceived not as healthcare, but as a strategic shield against prosecution.
Which fundamentally alters how the public views the state, right? I mean, if the institutions meant to enforce the law are perceived as being complicit, allowing themselves to be blinded by flight tickets and medical excuses, then the social contract is entirely void.
They're completely broken.
It's the difference between the law acting as a universal standard and the law acting as a net that only catches the small fish. If the people at the top can just buy a ticket out of consequences, the poet is tapping into the anger of a public asking, well, what is the point of the rules for the rest of us?
And that anger compounds when you consider the mechanism of this evasion. The frustration isn't merely that a corrupt official left the country.
Right, it's how they left.
Exactly, it's that the state apparatus facilitated it. When a citizenry believes that the border agents, the judges, the investigators are all just quietly nodding along to a transparent medical excuse, it breeds a deep, systemic cynicism.
I can imagine.
The public basically begins to view the justice system as a theater production, where the elites are the only ones with the script.
And the rest of the country is just forced to sit in the audience and watch the getaway.
Precisely.
Wow. Okay, so fleeing the country is just one way to avoid justice. But the poem naturally forces us to look at what happens when these figures stay right within the country's borders.
Yeah, the internal subversion.
Right. And the poet's imagery shifts here from evasion to outright humiliating subjugation of state institutions. We move into these highly evocative, almost theatrical descriptions of law enforcement in the third and sixth stanzas.
And really striking imagery.
It is. There's the mention of a queen,
Mhm.
which is clearly a figure of immense privilege, who simply refuses to go to the police.
Just says no.
She just says no, and that's the end of it. But then the physical verbs the poet uses get so visceral. The CID, the Criminal Investigation Department, is described as crawling to a suspect.
Yeah.
The police are squirming or acting submissively near the powerful.
The physical posture of the state is completely inverted in those lines.
Exactly. I mean, think about the psychological impact of the word crawling on the reader.
It's heavy.
It really is. It strips away all the dignity, all the supposed monopoly and authority that the state holds, and puts the institution on its belly before political power.
Yeah, it's a pathetic picture.
But the poet doesn't just leave it at descriptive imagery. Right in the middle of painting this picture, the text breaks a fourth wall.
Oh, right.
The poet asks, "Why give relief to thieves that we don't get?" It's a very raw, direct question to the listener.
It really catches you off guard.
Yeah. It seems to me that the poet structures it this way to force the reader out of a passive state. It's demanding that the reader acknowledge their own complicity or victimization in this two-tiered system.
I would actually take that a step further and say that question is the beating heart of the societal trauma the poem is exploring.
Oh, interesting. How so?
Well, when a citizenry observes institutions meant to protect them literally bowing down to a ruling class, it creates a caste system of justice. The poem explicitly points out that court cases for the powerful are always postponed.
Always postponed, yeah.
We have to look at the structural mechanism of that delay. Time is a luxury the poor do not have in the legal system.
That is so true.
The public sees an average person arrested, processed, and jailed immediately for a minor offense. But complex corruption bases involving the elite, they're slow-walked for years.
Right, the police squirm and look the other way.
Exactly. And the CID crawls to accommodate the schedules of the rich.
It perfectly illustrates the difference between the law as a shield and the law as a weapon.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
Thanks. I mean, for the elite, the law is this heavily padded shield constructed out of endless postponements, procedural delays, jurisdictional loopholes. But for the common citizen, the law is a weapon that strikes with absolute, immediate certainty.
That is a very precise way to look at it. And when the poet asks, why give relief to thieves that we don't get? They're capturing the active nature of that inequality.
Not passive at all.
No, it's not a passive failure of the system.
Yeah.
The public perception is that the state apparatus actively works to relieve the burdens of the powerful while simultaneously maximizing the burdens on the common citizen.
So the crawling and squirming aren't just metaphors.
Not at all. They are a public indictment of institutional independence. The police are no longer viewed as neutral arbiters of justice. In the eyes of the frustrated public, they've been reduced to a private security force for the ruling faction.
And the devastating reality of a state acting as private security for the corrupt leads us into the heaviest, most somber terrain of this text.
Yeah, the shift in tone here is really intense.
It is, because the poem doesn't just stick to white-collar crime or politicians quietly siphoning money into offshore accounts. It forces a collision between economic theft and unresolved, violent national trauma.
Right, the reference to the Easter bombs.
Yes. The emotional weight of this stanza is staggering. The text directly accuses military intelligence and the police of harboring mass murderers and telling thousands of lies to protect the people who planted those explosives.
It's a profound escalation.
It really is.
We are moving from the realm of delayed court cases into the realm of mass casualties and alleged state cover-ups.
Right. And from a literary standpoint, the juxtaposition the poet uses here is incredibly jarring. In one breath, we are confronting the visceral horror of a mass casualty terrorist event.
Yeah.
In the very next breath, the text talks about the former corrupt ruling faction subduing the people by taking taxes, commissions, and ransoms.
It's quite a leap.
Yeah. I mean, at first glance, a bombing and a stolen tax commission seem like totally different categories of crime. One is a sudden bloody tragedy, and the other is a slow, bureaucratic bleeding of public funds. But the poet binds them together tightly. Why does the poet combine the trauma of a bombing with the theft of public funds in the same breath?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, that juxtaposition makes devastating sense.
Okay.
The public relies on the state for two fundamental pillars of existence, right? Physical security and economic stability.
Right, the basics of the social contract.
Exactly. And when a society is suffering under perceived totalizing corruption, the elite are seen as willing to sacrifice both of those pillars to maintain their grip on power. To the everyday person reading this poem, the state is failing on both fronts simultaneously.
So it's a complete collapse of the state's mandate.
Exactly. The intelligence failures, the harboring of murderers, the thousands of lies surrounding the Easter bombs, that represents the ultimate betrayal of physical security. The state failed to protect the bodies of its citizens.
And then on the economic side?
On the other hand, the stolen taxes, the ransoms, the commissions, that represents the betrayal of economic security. The state is essentially cannibalizing the labor and the future of its citizens.
So they're intimately linked.
Yes. The poet puts these two things side by side because, in the public consciousness, they are symptoms of the exact same disease.
The victims are the same in both scenarios.
Exactly.
I mean, whether you lose your family in a preventable act of violence because of political games or you slowly starve because the nation's wealth has been looted by a ruling faction, the root cause is the unchecked hubris of the powerful.
Yeah, that lack of accountability covers everything.
It really paints a picture of a ruling class where your life and your wallet are just different accounts they can withdraw from at will. To the corrupt factions described in the text, life and money are equally cheap.
And when a society reaches that level of totalizing corruption, where both life and livelihood are routinely sacrificed by the elite without consequence, national trauma begins to fester.
It doesn't just go away.
No, it calcifies, turns into a multi-generational grievance. The public realizes that the squirming police force and the crawling investigators who protect the financial thieves are the exact same institutions protecting the mass murderers.
It's a single, monolithic wall of impunity.
Yes, exactly.
Which explains why polite requests for reform vanish from the text. I mean, when the wall of impunity is that thick, the rhetoric has to escalate to match it.
It absolutely does.
And that brings us to the final and arguably most intense segment of our analysis. The poem doesn't just list these grievances and fade out on a note of despair. It builds to a crescendo of absolute radical demands.
The fifth stanza.
Yes, the fifth stanza. The shift from descriptive lamentation to commanding action is sharp here.
Very sharp.
The poet stops asking questions and starts issuing directives. We see demands to, quote, throw those with wicked deeds into prison, to nationalize the stolen wealth, and most strikingly, the call to put the noose on those who murdered.
The language completely shifts from a plea for justice to a demand for retribution.
It really does. But let me play devil's advocate for a second here.
Okay.
Calling for the noose capital punishment and demanding the blanket nationalization of assets that borders on revolutionary rhetoric. Is this just blind poetic rage, or is there a specific logic to these demands?
That's a great question, and we really have to ground these fiery demands in analytical context. I don't read this as just blind poetic rage at all.
Really?
No, there is a deeply calculated, desperate logic at play here. Think back to the ecosystem the poet has built over the previous stanzas.
Right, the judicial delays, the medical tourism to Singapore.
Exactly. The CID crawling to suspects. If a society truly believes that the standard mechanisms of justice are entirely rigged, then a standard prison sentence feels completely hollow.
Because they'll just get out of it.
Right. A corrupt politician will just bribe the judge, delay the trial for 2 decades, or, live in a VIP hospital wing once convicted. So the public's imagination has to turn towards solutions that the corrupt system cannot dilute.
Oh, wow. That makes so much sense. So when the legal system is viewed as a marketplace where outcomes are bought and sold, the citizenry starts demanding penalties that cannot be purchased.
That is the exact analytical context required to understand these lines.
You demand nationalization because you have to physically strip them of the capital they use to buy the police.
Precisely. You target the assets because the wealth is the engine of their impunity. Without the stolen wealth, they can't afford the VIP treatment.
And what about the call for the noose?
You demand the noose capital punishment for the killers.
Yeah.
Because death is the ultimate finality. In the logic of a broken system, death is the only sentence that cannot be postponed, appealed, or avoided, with a doctor's note for medical treatment abroad.
It is the only outcome that a squirming police force cannot undo.
Exactly. It's an attempt to circumvent the corrupt legal system entirely.
The message is basically, you refuse to hold yourselves accountable through the courts, so we are demanding the one irreversible penalty you can't manipulate.
Yeah, it's not just about vengeance. It's a desperate demand for systemic reform. It's about a need for finality in a system that thrives on endless loopholes.
That is so intense.
It is, and
Yeah.
we have to recognize what a terrifying metric that is for the health of a democracy.
Oh, definitely.
When the citizenry feels that only a complete radical seizure of stolen assets and the ultimate irreversible penalty can restore any semblance of balance, it means the public faith in the gavel is completely dead.
The social contract has just completely degraded.
Degraded to a point where the only language the public feels the state will understand is the language of absolute, unyielding force.
The gavel is dead, so the poetry demands the gallows.
Wow. Yeah.
As we bring this analysis to a close, let's synthesize the journey this text has taken us on. Weerathunga W. Nemal's poem utilizes incredibly vivid, targeted imagery to deconstruct the anatomy of systemic injustice.
It's a really powerful text.
We started with the bureaucratic evasion of the elite, the sanctioned escapes to foreign countries, blinding the law with medical excuses. We analyzed the visceral disgust in the words used for law enforcement, visualizing state institutions that should stand tall instead crawling and squirming for the privileged.
Right.
And then we waded through the heavy, unresolved trauma of the Easter bombs, sitting adjacent to economic plunder, illustrating a reality where physical and financial violence are merely two sides of the same corrupt coin.
And socially, we traced how those localized failures compound into a profound societal exhaustion. We looked at a public push to a breaking point by double standards and institutional rot. The text captures that precise volatile moment when public frustration abandons the hope of incremental reform and turns into a demand for a total systemic overhaul.
Manifesting in those calls for radical asset seizures and irreversible punishments.
Exactly.
It is a heavy, intense reflection of a society's breaking point. And, as a final reminder to you listening, our exploration today has been an exercise in dissecting that intensity.
Right, just analyzing the text.
Exactly. We have analyzed the accusations, the anger, and the demands within this poem as a cultural and literary artifact. We are exploring the text to understand the depth of the public's frustration, not endorsing a political faction, taking a side on the claims, or calling for these actions ourselves.
That's right. The value of this text lies in understanding why these words resonate so deeply with the disenfranchised public.
Absolutely.
Because understanding the architecture of that anger is essential if we want to comprehend the broader societal shifts occurring around us.
And that brings me to a final lingering thought I want to leave you with today. We open this deep dive noting how poetry is usually an abstract art form, right?
Yeah, usually.
But here, it functions as a literal, unyielding indictment. So consider this. When the official channels of justice, the police, the courts, the investigators, are perceived by the public to be completely broken and subservient to the elite, the public square begins to shrink.
It really does.
What happens to a society when the poetry of its people is forced to turn from art into a desperate list of indictments?
That's a chilling question.
If a poem becomes the only courtroom left where the public feels they can actually be heard, what does that mean for the future of that